Oh, good day to you, friend. Seamus here. Thank you for joining me today. It's been a while since we had a little visit. This is something a little bit different today. It's another one of those modern day fables, and we're just going to call this one simply, Hey, that ham is just too big. It starts not all that long ago, not very many years ago at all. There was a young couple, had been in love for quite some time, had gotten together, made all the big decisions, got married, saved and scraped and pinched their pennies, and put together a down payment for a lovely little home. And they had just recently moved in, and they were wanting to do something by way of a celebration. And the young lady remembered that one of her favorite meals growing up was the ham that her family always made at Thanksgiving. And even though it wasn't Thanksgiving, it was getting close, but it wasn't there yet, they thought a lovely ham cooked in their new kitchen, in their new oven, in their new pot, all that good stuff would be just the way to celebrate this big event in their lives. So off they went to the store. They found themselves a nice, what you call a boned, rolled, and tied ham, and they got it home, and they got all their favorite fixings to go along with it, and they did all the preparation. And on the day of the big cook, off she went into the kitchen, and she had all of her vegetables ready, and everything was set to go. She had checked all of her temperatures and guidelines, checked with Mom to make sure the recipe for the seasoning was just right. You know, there was a little bit of cinnamon and nutmeg and some honey and brown sugar and good things like that. And they were very, very excited about all of this. And just before they got started to put they were ready to put the ham in the oven, she took a big butcher knife and she cut about 1.5 inches off of each end, rubbed the ends with more of the spice, dropped it into the pot, and whacked it into the oven to cook. Well, you wouldn't be surprised that, as the cooking time went on, they were getting closer to dinner. Her fella came in to get the dishes and to help set the table, and he noticed that there was 2 slices of ham in the fridge. And he asked her, he said, what's this ham from? And she said, well, I trimmed off the ham before I put it in the oven. He said, well, why did you trim the ham? Why didn't you just cook the whole thing? She gave him a look. He went, no, I'm not arguing. You're cooking it and I'm looking forward to it, but I'm just wondering why. And she looked at him for a moment. She scratched her head and she said, you know what? I have no idea. It's just always the way that I've seen it done. Well, they enjoyed their meal. It was very, very good. The ham was delicious, and they had a couple of nice slabs left over to cook up later in the week for a supper or something like that. But still, it kept troubling her. Why did I cut the ends off the ham? So the next morning, she picked up the phone, and she called her mother, and she said, Mom, on the weekend, John and I, we got together. We decided as a celebration, we'd cook a lovely ham in our new kitchen. And I did everything that you told me to do. You remember I checked with you about the seasoning, and it turned out really, really nicely. But I was wondering, and John was wondering too, why is it that I cut about 1 inch off of each end of the ham before I cooked it? I don't understand. I mean, it's good ham and we'll eat it, but why? Well, her mother thought for a moment. And she said, well, all I can tell you is it's just the way that I was taught to do it by your grandmother, my mom. And you know what? We're getting together for lunch today. Why don't you ask Grandma when we get together? So she did that very thing. Later that day, they all got together for a bite of lunch, and over the course of the meal, the young woman looked at her mother and looked at her grandmother, and she said, Grandma, I'm curious about something. And she told her the story. I'm not going to repeat it, but she told her the story about how, a weekend or so before, she had made a nice ham, and she seasoned it the way Mom did it, and Mom, of course, got it from her. And why is it that they cut about 1 inch off of each end of the ham? Well, the grandmother had the same response. She thought for a moment, and she says, that's the way my mother taught me, and I never really have understood why, but the hams always turned out nicely, and, there was always some left for later, but I never really understood why. You know what? None of us have anything to do this afternoon. How about when we're done our lunch, we jump in the car, and we go to the village where Grandma's living. We go to, her retirement home. We'll surprise her with a nice visit, and we can ask her. So now they've already gone from, the daughter to the mom to the grandma. They're working their way back through the generations, and they finish up their lunch. They pile in the car, and they drive to the retirement home, and they walk in, and they surprise great grandma. Surprise! Here's a cup of tea, and here's a scone, and we brought you a sandwich, and it's so good to see you. And they're sitting and they're visiting. And finally, the mom, the grandma, the second generation said, Mother dear, she said, we have a question for you. Actually, young Mary, recently married young Mary, has a question for you. So Mary told her great-grandmother the whole story and how the curiosity was sparked about why we always did it that way. And before she even got finished, great-grandma was already chuckling and having a good little bit of a belly laugh. And finally, Mary said, okay, Gigi, what is it? Why is this so funny, and why do we do it this way? And the great-grandmother looked at her and she said, well, dear, you have to remember that when your great-grandfather and I married, It was way back shortly before the start of the Second War. We were just coming out of the tail end of Depression. Things were difficult, and even though we were new marrieds, there was times where your great-grandfather had trouble finding work. And one of the things he did a few days a week is he would go in late in the day to an old neighborhood butcher shop. And he would help clean up. He'd sweep up all the sawdust off the floor and he'd get rid of the nasty bits. Well, we're not going to talk about those, but the way that he got paid, rather than the butcher giving him money, is the butcher would send him home with a hunk of meat. And every once in a while, if we were really lucky, once every 3 or 4 months or so, he'd send him home with a ham that had been cut to order and then not picked up. And it was a wonderful, wonderful treat. Well, the first time that happened, dear, what happened is we had recently moved into our first apartment together. Oh, and it was just a tiny little place. It wasn't much bigger than just your living room is now. We had a tiny little bathtub and a itty-bitty sink and toilet. We had a sink not bigger than a dishpan, and our oven wasn't even 2 feet wide on the outside. And I had this roast pan that wasn't much more than about that big. Well, the first time your father brought home one of these hams, of course, it was a big butcher cut ham. It still had some of the bone in it. It had all the nice fatty bits, but I couldn't help but look at it. And I told your great-grandfather, I said, I'm delighted to have a ham, but honey, hey, that ham is just too big. So I went ahead and seasoned it the way that I had been taught, and I tore away some of the gristle from one end, and I cut a big slice off the other end, and I took that trimmed down ham that I had cut small enough to fit into my itty-bitty roast pan to put into my teeny tiny oven, and we liked the way it turned out. So from then on, that's always the way I did it. And sometimes we would save that bit of ham for a meal later on. Sometimes what would happen is one of our best neighbors, her husband worked for a greengrocer, and we would trade her that nice slice of ham for some onions and carrots and potatoes, and we both end up getting a nice meal out of it. But that's why, dear. It's just because at the time we had this great big ham and just an itty-bitty roast pan. And I guess because we liked it, we did it that way. And your mother learned it from me, or your grandmother learned it from me, and your mother learned it from her, and now you've learned it from all of us, and that's why. Well, just a few weeks later, it was coming up onto Thanksgiving, and the young couple decided to invite the whole family to their house for Thanksgiving dinner that year. And you know, of course, she was planning on cooking a ham. And she went to the local meat market and she got herself a nice ham, and she got it the way she got it growing up. She had it bone rolled and tied with most of the bone out, and it was maybe trimmed, and it was all tied up real good. And she got that thing home and she slathered the whole thing with all of her favorite spices, cinnamon and nutmeg and maybe a little bit of ginger, I don't know, and some brown sugar and honey, maybe some apple cider in there. I don't know how she did it, but it sounds delicious. And she took that whole great big ham and she put that whole thing inside of her great big roast pan, which she then stuffed into her great big 30-inch wide oven. And she made enough food that night to feed her whole family 2 times over. Everybody went home with leftovers. Everybody was, expressing congratulations for making a wonderful meal. Everybody left happy. The next morning for breakfast, you won't be surprised when her and her husband both had ham and eggs. And they sat there chuckling over their second cup of coffee. And he asked her, what is so funny? And she said, all those years, we did it that way just because that's the way great-grandma did it. Great-grandma did it that way because she had to. And all these years later, that tradition has stuck. I love the way grandma makes a ham, but we're going to cook the whole thing from now on. I got thinking about this story a few days ago, friends, and I wondered how many things in my own life, and I'm in my 7th decade now, how many things I still do in my life because just that's the way I was brought up to do it, and it's because my dad was brought up that way to do it, and it probably goes back generations before that. And how many things in our life would be different if we thought maybe, just maybe, as good as traditions are, there might just be a better way. I don't know what you're having for supper tonight. I'm not having ham. I only wish I was. Thank you for joining me today. I appreciate you stopping by. Take good care of yourselves and take good care of each other. Feel free, please, to like this video here on YouTube. Share it with your friends. Subscribe. Hit the little bell thingy. Those of you that want to send me a treat, the link to buy me a coffee will be down below. But more than anything else, I'm so glad that you stopped in. As always, as I said, take good care of yourselves and of each other, and we will see you soon. Cheers. Oh, do 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 do.